Anthony Fardet, welcome to Weird Sauce, and thank you for welcoming us into your location, I believe somewhere in France, if I'm not wrong. Could you kindly introduce yourself for our audience?
Thank you for the invitation. I am a researcher in a French institute dedicated to agricultural, environmental, and diet research. I have been practicing public research since 23 years now, mainly in public research. I have been trained as an agri-food engineer in a French high school, Agro-Paris-Tech. And I also made some expertise for sustainable and healthy food. And my main research topic during these 23 years is the link between food processing, food matrix effect, and food health potential. And today I am studying this very fundamental relationship within the framework of sustainability, sustainable food system, notably the role of ultra-processed food in food system sustainability. I am also very interested in philosophy of science, notably the holistic and reductionist paradigm applied to food and nutrition research. And also, I have worked recently in a recently published paper on the application of two main research methods, empirico-inductive method and hypothetico-deductive method. And me as a researcher, I situate myself in holistic thinking, holistic approach, and empirico-inductive approach. This is very important to have this in mind to understand better my main research. To summarize, I am more interested in the link between the part of a system than in the parts in themselves. So reductionist researchers are used to study the part of a system. For food, this is the nutrient. But me, I am interested in holistic approach of food, which means the link between the nutrient, what we call the matrix effect. So holistic researchers are more focused on the link interaction. So we are not so many worldwide because reductionist thinking and hypothetical deductive method is the preferred and mainly used research approach.
So let's start with the fundamentals here, because I think you've said quite a lot, and there's a lot of very technical terms, and perhaps not everybody listening to you is familiar with those technical terms. So let's go back to fundamentally, we're talking about food. We'll start with that. We'll talk about food and the science behind the food that we grow and we eat and that we are exposed to. And also you mentioned the term ultra-processed food. So that's, I assume, is a technical term that can be differentiated from processed food and food as average person, by average I don't mean bad, I mean me, would define it as. So what's the difference between what I define as food, what is processed food, what is ultra-processed food, and is there a category after that? So could you perhaps start with helping us understand how is the food defined such that we understand in 2021 what our foods are sort of made of, and then we can go into the philosophical approach and the philosophy of science that you talked about.
Yes, it's a very important question. Thank you. I think we should first define what is a healthy food. Up today, we mainly focus on the composition of food to define a healthy food. This is what we have called the reductionist and quantitative fraction of food health potential, but it is not sufficient. A composition of food is useful to address nutritional deficiency, nutritional needs, to to measure food composition because this can be quantified by nutrient. But this is absolutely not sufficient to define the food health potential from a holistic point of view, because you can fully address nutritional need, but become chronically ill. So 2 years ago, we redefined the food health potential based on a more holistic approach, because food science is first a holistic science, not a reductionist science. And we combine composition fraction with the matrix fraction. The matrix of food is simply the result of the several interactions between nutrients, which constitute a three-dimensional structure of food. For example, an apple have a solid matrix, which can be red, green, which is more or less porous. This is the matrix. And matrix is fundamental because matrix governs the metabolic fate of nutrients. So nutrients are first neutral, and depending on the quality of the food matrix, they may become healthy or deleterious. So we have forgotten the fundamental role of food matrix, which play fundamental physiological and metabolic role in human organism. These roles are showing then satiety, then the regulation of food intake, which is fundamental, hence the presence of teeth. If we have teeth, this is because of food matrix first, not of nutrient. And let's recall that digestive process is first role is to deconstruct the food matrix so that nutrient may become bioavailable in human organism. So nutrient comes after the digestive process. So we have to focus on food matrix and hence degree of processing, but we will come back to this after. So matrix play a role on showing satiety, hormonal secretion, digestive transit time, glycemic index, protein anabolism, lipid metabolism, nutrient bioaccessibility, bioavailability, and metabolic use. And finally, the synergistic action of nutrients, which act in synergy between each other within human organism. So today, a healthy food is absolutely not a nutritionally balanced food, because there is no nutritionally balanced food which are supplied by nature, except breast milk. Hence, the recommendation to eat varied. If we recommend to eat varied, this is because no food is nutritionally balanced. So from a scientific basis, when we heard in media, etc., that when we talk about the nutritional balance of food, this is not scientifically founded. So today, a healthy food is simply the less processed food, to be edible and safe, sure, with the best matrix quality. So we have to preserve the matrix quality, because if we preserve the matrix quality, nutrient will become healthy for human organism. For example, glycemic index is first a question, an issue of food matrix. The higher the food matrix unstructuration of starchy food, the higher the glycemic index at equal carbohydrate composition. So consequently, type 2 diabetes is not first an issue of sugar, it's first an issue of degraded food matrix or excess consumption of acellular or amatrix sugar. When we added sugar, this is first sugar without matrix. So the fundamental issue is the matrix. So it is important to redefine clearly from based on the most recent and modern scientific result was this food health potential. So this is a fundamental changing paradigm, but which is essential for a large public. So why degree of processing is so important? Because it impacts not only composition, we know this from a long time, but mainly the food matrix. So the question for us researcher is what is the degree of processing which is correct, which is good for human health. So the important word is degree, because we eat processed food since the domestication of fire more than 1 million years ago, and we eat industrial processed food since more than 2 centuries ago with the invention of can with Nicolas Appert and appertization. So the question is not industrial food, not processed food. This is ultra processed food, which correspond to the last transition, food transition, just after the Second World War, where we move from normally industrially processed food to industrial ultra processed food. With the advent of modern technology, such as food cracking, extrusion cooking, puffing, and the use of many cosmetic additive and ingredients to modify the sensory property of food, which are four: color with eyes, aroma for smell, and in the mouth, taste and texture. So ultra-processed food comes from the NOVA classification, which was elaborated 10 years ago by a Brazilian epidemiological team led by Professor Carlos Monteiro. And what is the origin of NOVA? This epidemiological researcher in Brazil made an interesting observation. They observed in Brazilian kitchen during epidemiological survey that household where they can find table sugar, there were less chronic disease such as obesity, overweight, and type 2 diabetes. This is a paradox, but in the end not a paradox, because where they observed table sugar, this was an indirect sign that these households were still cooking at home real food. And in household where there was not table sugar, this means that the household buy more ready-to-eat meal, industrial ready-to-eat meal, where there is already sugar added. And there were more higher prevalence of obesity on type 2 diabetes in this household. So when observing food in the kitchen, we can find 4 types of food products. First, or minimally processed food, in which no substance are added. This is fresh fish, fresh meat, fresh fruit and vegetable, milk, yogurt, etc. Then you can find also culinary ingredients which are used since many years, which are traditional culinary ingredients, but you can eat culinary ingredient as such. Then there is processed food, normally processed food, when you add culinary ingredient to an or minimally processed food to increase palatability or preservation of food. We can find all traditional food. When you cook at home, this is normally processed food. And in France, we calculated that this corresponds to around 1/3 of all industrially processed food marketed in large retail. And then, finally, they observed that for a first group of food, which looks like processed food, but with largely higher, longer list of ingredients. Sometimes 2 or 3-fold more ingredient. And this food looks like processed food. This is the reason that I call fake food. And they call them ultra-processed food. And then after, so this was a very empirical approach, which starts with reality. So we go from reality to propose a new classification, a new holistic classification and qualitative classification. This is what we call the empirical inductive approach. This is a fundamental point to consider because, for example, composition score, which are used worldwide as the preferred tool of public health, are not empirical inductive model or algorithm. This is hypothetical deductive, and this makes all the difference. Because when we confront after this composition score to reality, to real life, it doesn't really work. Then after, today in more than 70 epidemiological studies, it was observed that excess consumer of ultra-processed food are more at risk of many chronic disease and early mortality worldwide, whatever the country and whatever the part of human organism which has been studied. So the ultra-processed food is finally it is a holistic concept in the way that this is the whole which is problematic, not a part of the whole. And finally, we distinguish 4 markers of ultra-processing: aroma, artificial or natural or aroma extract, 80% of additive, which are cosmetic additives to modify color, taste, and texture, ultra-processed macronutrients such as ultra-processed fiber, lipid, protein, carbohydrate. For carbohydrate, we have invert sugar, maltodextrin, glucose syrup, glucose fructose syrup, dextrose, polydextrose, barley malt extract, sugar alcohol, etc., starch, modified starch, gluten, etc. No, gluten is ultra-processed protein, which are protein isolate that we found very much in meat substitute. And we find also hydrogenated and refined oil. And finally, fiber isolate. And the first category of marker of ultra-processing are drastic processes directly applied to the food matrix, such as extrusion, cooking, and puffing, because they explode the food matrix. So the common point of all these markers of ultra-processing is either the degradation of food matrix, drastic degradation, or when you have purified ingredient, which can be thereafter modified by enzymatic and chemical modification, you have no more matrix. And when we recombine sometimes marker of ultra-processing, such as in plant beverage, meat substitute, sometimes we have only recombined marker of ultra-processing and new food matrices. This is the reason why I call this food fake food. Or we can add cosmetic ingredient and agent in a real food, such as in ready-to-eat meal. So the fundamental point, and I conclude on this point, in ultra-processing, which are modern processes that cannot find in kitchen, it is the loss of matrix effect. So the answer to the first question, what is the degree of processing acceptable for global health, including human and environmental health, this degree, which is no more acceptable, is the drastic food matrix unstructuration into the constitutive part and to recombine them.
That sounds like a Frankenstein recipe. So to the ear of someone like myself who's in healthcare, but I'm not in food manufacturing, it sounds to me like the agro feeding environment or the industrial food environment, for whatever reasons, we won't go into that, has decided that chemically it is possible to assemble um, a a chimera of food, similarly to what we do with viruses and in 2021, a very interesting subject. So, what you described to me is something that looks like food, that may smell like food, that may taste like food, but metabolically is a substance that we ingest that is going to have separate metabolic consequences to what food would be expected to have and why we would
Yes.
ingest it. So I'm curious to know that France is an agriculture country historically. So would you say that this problem of what you called fake food or Frankenstein food or whatever we want to name it,
Red sauce.
um, yeah, is an issue geographically very identifiable, or is it now a worldwide problem?
Yes, it is a very important question. Thank you. This is a worldwide problem. First, ultra processing spread in Western country after the Second World War. It begins in the 16 in night sorry in the in 1960 1970 in the previous century, and glucose fructose syrup was developed by a Japanese engineer for USA, which was searching for a cheap sugar to replace cane sugar, for the reason you guess, because cane sugar came mainly from Cuba, where and taxes increased. But the first marker of ultra processing was developed in 1811 by a German engineer, which added sulfuric acid to starch. This was the first modified starch. But this was very localized in some Anglo-Saxon country. But this is after the Second World War that ultra processing developed in Western country. And this huge development, which reached a peak in the 80s and 90s in our Western country, is concomitant with the explosion of prevalence of chronic disease in Western countries. This is also concomitant with the stagnation of the healthy life years, the years lived without chronic disease. For example, in France, this is 64 years, and the theoretical life expectancy is 83. So in France, we are living 19 years with a chronic disease. So we live longer, but we live longer with chronic disease. Because healthy life years in France in the 80s was also 64 years. So they stagnate. This is curious. So today, because the Western market is saturated by ultra processing, this fake food begins to penetrate emerging country and developing country, and where whatever the country where this food penetrates the market, the chronic disease begins in parallel to emerge and increase. For example, in France, ultra-processed calorie consumed daily is around 35%, but in Anglo-Saxon country, this is more than 40, 50, sometimes 60% of daily calorie. In Brazil, this is around 25 calorie daily, but this is increasing. In China, this is also around probably between 15 and 20 daily calorie, but this is sharply increasing. So this is a quite very important problem, because the concept of ultra-processed food is only the visible part of the iceberg. But we have to see below this visible part and all the agro-food system which sustain ultra-processing. Because this fresh food has the first intent to replace real food, traditional food, notably in emerging and developing countries, moving the youngest from their food tradition and to create new generation of young people used to very easy test, highly standardized test, highly standardized food, which are the same all over the world. So this can have dramatic consequences for the youngest. And this is so there is not only the problem of health, there is also the socio-cultural problem, socio-economic, because the widespread of use of these ultra-processed food threaten small, older agriculture, small farmer, because locally, a real food, a traditional food, may be more expensive than an ultra-processed food coming from several hundred kilometers away. For example, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, local milk or dairy products are sometimes more expensive than dried milk mixed with palm oil or etc. And we can observe this fact in several emerging and developing countries. There is also another problem because these food are conceived to be consumed in isolated situation, in front of a screen, when you are traveling. So they are over-packaged with plastic pollution, and there is a kind of relation between the fragmentation of food and the fragmentation of social life. So it is not rare in Western country to see in a family, each member of the family consuming each ultra-processed food in isolated situation at its own hour in the day. So ultra-processed food do not favor the share of meals with family, with friends, with groups. There is also another problem because in Western country, the poorest people, the more disadvantaged people consume the most this product and are more at risk of obesity, overweight, hepatic steatosis, and type 2 diabetes. And on the contrary, in emerging country and developing country, these food are the most consumed by the richest people because they are a sign of how do we say in English, of external richesse, external
success, wealth, yeah.
Exactly, because they are these food are produced by international brand and agro-food companies. So it is, and in some countries such as in Maghreb, for example, to be overweight can be also a sign of wellness. So this is two different situations in Western country and emerging and developing country. Then ultra-processed food are characterized by the presence of one or several markers of ultra-processing. And these markers of ultra-processing mainly come from intensive agriculture and breeding or livestock, with monoculture, with a low level of biodiversity, because this marker of ultra-processing comes from mainly wheat, maize, rice, potato for ultra-processed sugar, pea and soybean for ultra-processed protein isolate, then milk, egg, and meat. So you have only a few products produced in intensive conditions which are unstructured to produce marker of ultra-processing. So that today it is more interesting from an economic point of view to sell separately the part of the food than the initial food. it is more profitable to sell the part than the initial complex food. And these intensive monoculture and intensive livestock are linked to animal suffering, loss of biodiversity, deforestation, pollution by plastic, pesticide, and also the disappearance, as I told before, of smallholder agriculture, small farmers, small peasants. And finally, this written culinary tradition in country. So it is important to resist to this food because we can lose our tradition, our culinary tradition. Alors, this is not to say that we should not eat ultra processed food, but in preventive nutrition, in preventive diet, ultra processed food should be the exception to help in some niche context, but not the basis of our diet. But on the contrary, in curative nutrition for people with chronic disease, or for example, people who are not able to deconstruct food matrix with their digestive process, in this case, it can be useful to give to these people ultra-processed food, just as parental and enteral nutrition, to supply directly the nutrient to the organism because their digestive process is not able to deconstruct the food matrix. But this is curative nutrition. This is not my job. I am a researcher in preventive nutrition, but in prevention, this is the exception, not the rule. It is important to say that.
So, moving on to not that the analysis that you just did, not that it's a joy to hear because it's a catastrophic replay of a situation. So, if somebody is listening to this, and I'm sure they've heard some part of that before in other contexts, what can an individual that has maybe family or a group of people living with them and is not a scientist, even with access to internet and ability to check things for themselves, what can an individual do considering that we live in an integrative system? So education doesn't seem to have component of education about food and the evolution of food to today. The family is not necessarily capable of passing this knowledge onto the children, and society has perverse incentive of negative incentives seemingly present for someone not to be able to do this, whether they're financial negative incentive or availability, food deserts, whatever
Yes.
that may be, or captive science, which is also now a problem. So how can an individual in this maze do things that can least negatively impact them or positively impact themselves and their environment?
You mean what can an individual do to avoid ultra-processed food?
To navigate this and to equip themselves both on the knowledge. For example,
Yes.
you've listed so many components. A lot of people are familiar with food
Yeah.
only with diets. So diets are the things that people are prepared to die on the hill of, like a vegan or keto, or and yet it seems to be a whole discussion that we're not having beyond the diet, which is about the non-debased nature of our food. So this is where what I meant by how can someone navigate this and survive?
Yes, the word navigate is the good term, notably in large food retail. We navigate. Yes, in France, we calculated that on a representative sample of industrial food in small in average and large food retail, that around 70% of food are ultra processed. So there is a false huge diversity. This is not a diversity of real food. This is a diversity of recombination of marker of ultra processing. This is a false diversity. the first reflex, I think, is to read the list of ingredients. We also calculated, which is a robust number, that robust percentage, a number that above 5 ingredients, which means 6 or and more, you have more than 75% of chance to be in front of an ultra-processed food. So this is a good indicator. When you have flashy packages, very packaging with high color, a lot of flashy color, this is another sign. When you have false LC, how do we say?
Claims?
Claims, yes. For example, a source of calcium, a source of fiber, enriched with vitamin, enriched with mineral, enriched with fiber, or light product, gluten-free product. When you have mentioned focus on one nutrient, this is mainly the sign of ultra-processing. Because we focus your mind on one nutrient which is supposed to be either healthy or to be withdrawn, but we forget to see the whole food. And generally, the whole food is of low quality and ultra-processed food. For example, there is ultra-processed cheese for children in France, which are edible chemistry, which with the mention source of calcium. But this is not calcium which is important. This is the whole food. For example, you have breakfast cereal for children, which mention of whole grain flour, whole grain wheat, source of fiber enriched with mineral. In USA, this is very, very widespread breakfast cereal. But this is sugar bomb and ultra-processed food. And cooking extrusion render the cereal near glucose in your organism with a high glycemic index. So consumer has to see the whole food, and the only way of approaching the quality of the whole food is only the list of ingredients. So this is the first solution. In France, we have developed an application, a smartphone application for detecting degree of processing and ultra-processed feed, which is the SIGA classification. We have published 3 scientific peer-reviewed papers about our methodology. This is another way. The other way is to go to air market, but this is not always possible in many countries because people are living in a huge, very huge city. So I guess it is not easy. But you mentioned food deserts, which are very frequent in USA, for example. For example, you can make 100 kilometers in car and not able to find a fresh market. There is only fast food and ultra-processed food. So there is real food desert. In this case, it is not easy. So it would be too easy to tell people to cook at home because it is not possible. So I think one of the main points is to try to find industrial food which are not ultra-processed because they exist. You can buy pasta, legumes, which are sold in package, in cartoon, en carton. How do we say en carton?
Cardboard.
Voilà. Legumes. You can buy canned food. Many canned food are not ultra processed. You can buy frozen food and frozen vegetable. So it is possible to eat well without cooking. There is the possibility of doing this. In France, it is quite possible. In Anglo-Saxon country, I guess it is more difficult. But the fundamental issue is what I have called, and other researcher as well, the nutri-centered approach. So it's an issue of food education, and we should move away from this reductionist nutri-centered approach, which is only at the benefit of agro-food industry but not of public health. In preventive nutrition, we are not finally obliged to talk about nutrient. This is not nutrient which prevent you from chronic disease. This is the matrix quality of your food and the degree of processing. So you have to focus on the whole food. This is the only solution I see today, but food education is obviously the most sustainable solution in the long term, to have several generations of young people educated on what is a healthy food. And a healthy food is not a nutritionally balanced food, but the less processed one. I think we have to tell this to large public. This changing paradigm is very important.
And in your job as a scientist, I'm quite mindful of how capture science has been revealed to be, at least in other fields, such as research in other diseases and pharmacology, and the role of big pharma in investing in science and research with the evident goal that they have in mind. So I'm wondering, given the subject that you're studying and what you are showing about what is commonly called big food, have you experienced or pushback, or is it difficult to fund such research that's going to effectively exhume all the skeleton and or basically going to poke holes into the narratives of big food? So is it difficult for you to get funded and to get published? Do you have pushback, or are you basically, so far, at least in France, free to research very problematic, potentially problematic subject because of their potential outcome and repercussion into the industry?
Yes, to change paradigm is always difficult. Because when you move from incremental innovation or research to breakthrough research, it is not the same. So it is always difficult to propose to change paradigm. And empirico-inductive research, that is my particularity, is very close to changing paradigm. So yes, it was not easy because you are not in the mainstream. So in public research, to be in the mainstream is more easy to find money. But things are going to change. There is I feel that at the world level, there is the great move should be to move from reductionist nutrition to holistic nutrition, because nutrition is a holistic science or discipline by essence. It is not a reductionist scientific topic. It is a holistic scientific topic. So we have to move to the origin of diet, food, science. Difficulty, yes, I have some difficulty when I published my first book for large public in 2017. I have a second book to come at the end of November of this year. I have critics, but the main opposition, it's not really private public, big food public. The main opposition comes from the changing paradigm. And the changing paradigm is to move away from reductionist kingdom to holistic kingdom. This is a real issue. And most of critics comes from academic, not multinational. But they come from both private and academic parts, which are in common to be based on the reductionist paradigm. So this is because I ask myself, why there is so many critics from academic researcher and not so much from private multinational or agro-food industry, because this is critics which come from academic researcher based and used to make research on the nutri-centered approach. So this is the fundamental issue. This is first to combine reductionism and holism. We have to combine both, but we have to work in the good way. That means from holism to reductionism and not the contrary. We cannot move, we cannot generalize from only specific part of a system. So we cannot go from reductionist thinking to holistic thinking. We first think holistically, and we conduct or we carry out reductionist research only within the framework of holistic thinking, and reductionism should not disconnect from the initial complex system. So to answer to your question, the main issue is here actually, and main critics, all critics at 100% come from the reductionist kingdom. I would say the ultra-reductionist kingdom, because ultra-reductionism has disconnected from real life, from real food. And yes, this is always more difficult not to be in the mainstream for funding research, but I can say that today things are going to change, and it's okay for me. I always succeed in finding money and to deposit a research project at European level. But no, it's okay. It's okay for me.
I'm glad to hear that. So, what before we conclude this conversation, what are you looking for in terms of evidences of positive change and positive direction for the years to come? Because I assume it's going to take years.
Yes, I am optimistic by nature, very optimistic by nature. I think we are entering the fifth transition, which is a sustainable food transition. But we should make this transition based on the holistic paradigm, not the reductionist paradigm. The reductionist paradigm, this is meat substitute, meat in vitro meat, to use insect, but without never questioning the agro-food system behind this. This is a reductionist sustainable transition. No, the good new transition should be based on holistic thinking, which we have conceptualized in our laboratory in the framework of the 3V rule. What are the 3V rule? In French, this means vrai, vegetal, varié. In English, vrai is real food, vegetal is plant-based food, vegetal food, and varié is varied food. This is a robust, generic, and universal framework to give good direction for our food system and the quality of our diet, which have to combine all three generic dimensions and not forget one dimension. And the emerging dimension is the real dimension, real food, which is food processing, which have been neglected up to date. And now we have this missing link. All is becoming very clear. For example, if you eat more and more plant-based products to replace meat, but if these vegetable products are ultra-processed, this is not really good for global health. If you eat real food, plant-based food, but monotonous, this is not so good for biodiversity, and you can have nutritional deficiency. And finally, if you eat animal, real food, and varied, this is not sustainable for the planet because we cannot eat so much animal calorie daily. Probably the median equilibrium is a maximum of 15% animal calorie daily and 15% ultra-processed calorie daily, which means 1 to 2 ultra-processed product daily and maximum 3 animal serving per day. So, yes, this is a framework we have published in several papers, and we think that can indicate a direction for public policy, dietitian, food education, and this is a very universal framework. And other possibility to answer more specifically to your question, I think there is 3 levels of action. The first one, it's food education, but it is not easy to. For example, in France, there is food education is not in the core of education. It is only a transversal program, and it is not controlled. Second, at horizontal level, is to inform consumer. This is what I am trying to do. And the third level is politician, multinational, which should propose healthier product with more preserved food matrix, not to reformulate food, because to reformulate food, the food can remain ultra processed. So this is only an incremental and bad solution. So the main issue is to make less processed food, which is completely different. And politician can. I'm not sure that food taxes are the good solution, but what is important is that real food become less expensive than ultra processed food, because worldwide ultra processed food are cheap calorie. For example, in USA, this is at least 60% less expensive than real food and fresh food. In Belgium, this is around 56% less expensive, and in France, this is at least 16% less expensive. But which is interesting, for example, in France, we calculate within the framework of the 3V rule that a 3V shopping cart basket, food basket, is 5% less expensive than the normal basket, which is rich in animal calorie and ultra-processed calorie. Why? Because when you decrease animal calorie, which are often expensive, you can replace, for example, ultra-processed animal calorie by normally processed plant-based food. And in the end, this is not more expensive. So this is the good news. It is possible to eat well for global health, human health, and environmental health at the same price. And I often saw on French TV people who come back to the kitchen to cook food, and at the end of the month, finally, they spend less money. So I think it is possible, but as you know, any change needs at first level efforts. You cannot make a change without first effort, but after this can be, we can change the economic framework of food production from ultra-processed to minimally processed food.
So, Anthony, to conclude this conversation, as I always do for my guest, and to illustrate the title of the podcast, we're all waiting very curiously into finding out what is your weird sauce for life, considering that you've already started saying that you're an optimistic person, which is great considering what you're doing every day. So share with us, if you have one, what's your weird sauce for life?
My weird sauce, yes, it is the most difficult question you ask me during this hour. No, my word sauce is to stay optimistic, and notably because it is better for health to be optimistic, for immune system, for example. And no, I think my conclusion will be to revalorize the food and diet. This is a very important value for human. And we have, with ultra processing, we have put food at the same level as car. And we can see on TV food which are marketed as car, which are customized as cars. So this is at the same level, but this is not really at the same level, because you can live without car, but you cannot live without food. So food is very important. This sustain life, human, animal, environmental life. So what sustain life is of utmost value. This has no money value. This is not a question of first of money. So my word sauce is to try to rediscover the pleasure associated with food cooking, to share meal with people, and the pleasure of eating real food. And for example, to cook with our children, it can be a real pleasure. But yes, food should be in the top of our value. And I think this is a kind of human revolution of food, not a financial revolution, but a human revolution of food. This is only at this price that we can sustain food system, agriculture, peasant, etc., etc. Because, for example, a farmer or a breeder should not be a supplier of marker of ultra processing. They are supplier of good food with a good matrix quality. So food processing, food transformator should preserve these matrix quality which are supplied by farmers. And I'm not sure to have very well answer to your question about word sauce, but this is my way of thinking for the future. And I think this is the value we should communicate to the new generation of young people, that food is of utmost value for our planet.
Anthony Fardet, thank you very much for your insight and your optimism. And we wish you joy in eating and communicating the necessity of good food for life and good food for health. Thank you again.
Thank you, Florence.
If this conversation stopped you in your track, share it with your network. You never know whose life you might change for the better. Thank you for listening. Stay curious about our next guest and stay curious about life.